She smells like winter and weakness. You smell like the future." The words drifted through the carved oak door of the bridal chamber, and Seraphine Vale felt the mate bond in her chest snap like a frozen branch under boot heels. She had heard cruelty before in her 23 years, but never his. Never Kyle's. The pain that followed was not metaphor. It was a real and physical thing, a wire pulled taut behind her sternum and then cut, and she pressed her palm flat against the cold stone wall to keep from folding in half. Her wedding veil was still pinned into her hair. The candlelight from the corridor sconces flickered gold across the white silk of a gown she had chosen 3 days ago, while daring to believe she was loved. Inside the room, a woman laughed. Low, satisfied, familiar. Seraphine knew that laugh the way she knew her own heartbeat, because it belonged to Isolde, the girl who had braided her hair at 14, who had cried on her shoulder over a boy at 17, who had stood beside her at the ceremony not 3 hours ago as her chosen witness, her best friend, her sister in everything but blood. "Then take her collar off," Isolde purred. "Break the bond tonight. You promised me the throne, Kyle, not a shared bed." "Consider it done," said the Alpha King of the Ashmore territories, the male who had knelt before the Elder Council and vowed to cherish Seraphine until the last moon fell. "By dawn she'll be nothing, a discarded she-wolf with no name and no pack, and you, a rustle of fabric, a sound Seraphine would spend years teaching herself to forget. You'll be my queen." She did not scream. That was the first decision, and it saved her life. Screaming would have brought the guards, and the guards answered to Kale, and Kale had just decided she was refused to be swept out with the morning ash. So Seraphine stepped back from the door on silent feet, one hand still pressed to the wound that had no blood, and she let the ice come. It started in her fingertips and moved inward, and by the time it reached her heart, it had frozen the grief into something harder, something that could bear weight. She looked down the empty corridor toward the great hall, where their guests still danced, oblivious, celebrating a union that had already been slaughtered in a candlelit room. "I will not die in your house," she thought. "I will not beg at your door. And you will not know what you threw away until it is far too cold outside for you to ever come back in." She walked. Not fast, because fast draws eyes, but with the measured pace of a queen who belonged everywhere she stepped, which was precisely what she still appeared to be to every servant she passed. They bowed. She inclined her head. Behind the flawless mask, her mind moved with the speed of a thing that had prepared for this without ever admitting to itself that it was preparing. Because that was the secret Seraphine had never spoken aloud, not even to Isolde, especially not to Isolde. She had never fully trusted the fairy tale. Some quiet, watchful part of her had spent the 3 years of her courtship building a door she prayed she would never need. She reached her private dressing chamber and locked it behind her. Then she stripped. The wedding gown came off panel by panel, and she folded it with a care that surprised her, laying it across the chaise like a body being prepared for burial. Off came the sapphire circlet Kyle had placed on her brow that morning, the one that had belonged to his mother, the one he'd called a promise. She set it on the vanity. Off came the wedding ring, the great cold band of white gold with the Ashmore sigil pressed into it. She placed it dead center on the pillow of the bed she would never sleep in, so it would be the first thing seen and the last thing understood. Then she opened the false back of her wardrobe. Behind it, wrapped in oilcloth, was everything the girl who almost married a monster had left for the woman who would have to run. Traveling clothes in plain grey wool, boots broken in over months of quiet walks, a leather satchel heavy with coin she had skimmed, one careful piece at a time. From the household allowances, Cale never bothered to audit, because auditing was beneath a king. And papers. Land deeds under a name that was not Vale and not Ashmore. A letter of introduction to a trading house 4 territories east, signed by a woman Cale had dismissed from court 2 winters ago and never thought of again. Seraphine had thought of her. Seraphine remembered everyone, the powerful discarded, because some cold instinct had always whispered that she might one day join their ranks. She dressed in the grey wool. She braided her hair back tight and plain. She looked at herself in the tall mirror, and the bride was gone. And in her place stood something leaner and more dangerous, a creature with frost in its eyes, and a satchel of coin, and a heart that had learned in the space of an hour to beat for revenge instead of love. There would be time for grief later. There would be years for it, if she was honest. But grief was a luxury, and luxury was what she was leaving behind on a pillow with a ring. A soft knock, 3 taps, then 2. Seraphine's hand went to the small blade at her hip before her mind caught up to the pattern. It was Bram. She opened the door. The old stablemaster stood there in the dark, his weathered face grim beneath a shock of white hair, his knuckles swollen from 40 years of harness, leather, and cold mornings. Bram had taught her to ride when she first came to Ashmore, a frightened girl, had slipped her extra bread when the kitchen mistress was cruel, had never once bowed to her the way the others did, because he'd told her plainly that a bow was a thing you gave to a title, and respect was a thing you earned. "You heard," he said. It wasn't a question. The whole corridor heard, she said. I made sure I was the only one there too. His jaw worked. There's a horse saddled at the eastern gate, not one of the king's, my own. Nobody counts an old man's nag. He pressed something into her hands, a hunk of bread and hard cheese wrapped in cloth, still warm from his own supper. The gate guard tonight is my sister's boy. He'll look the other way for exactly the count of 200. You'll want to be through and gone by 180. Seraphine looked at this man, who had every reason to protect his own position, and had chosen instead to protect her, and for the first time since the words came through the door, the ice cracked. Just a hairline. Just enough. "Why?" she whispered. "Because I watched him look at that other one across the feast," Bram said, "and I watched him look at you, and only one of those looks had hunger in it, girl, and it wasn't the one aimed at his bride. I've served 3 kings in this house. I know rot when it starts to smell." He gripped her shoulder, hard, the way he might steady a spooked colt. "You go east and you don't look back and you don't die. You hear me? Living well. That's the only knife that ever cut a proud man deep." She nearly broke then. She let herself have 3 seconds of it, 3 seconds where her forehead touched the old man's shoulder and his rough hand cupped the back of her head, and then she straightened and the frost sealed over the crack. And she was ready. "When he asks who helped me," she said, "you knew nothing. You slept. Swear it." "I'll swear I was drunk," Bram said, "which given the night I'm about to have won't even be a lie." Something almost like a smile ghosted across his face. "Go on. Live long enough to make him sorry. I'd like to be alive to see it." She went, down the servants' stair, through the cold larder where the scent of hanging meat and dried herbs would be the last smell she ever associated with that castle, out a low door into the kitchen garden slick with dew. The night was clear and enormous overhead, a wheel of stars turning slow above the black towers of Ashmore. And somewhere far behind her, the music still played, and the guests still danced, and her husband of 3 hours was breaking a bond he had sworn before his gods to keep. She felt the last threads of it fraying as she walked, each severed strand a small, bright agony, and she gritted her teeth and let them go, all of them, until there was nothing left connecting her to the male who had called her winter and weakness. The horse was where Bram promised. A plain brown gelding with kind eyes and a saddle worth nothing to anyone who mattered. She mounted, and she rode for the eastern gate, and the boy on watch looked studiously up at the stars as she passed beneath the portcullis, counting silently, and she was through and into the trees before he reached 180. She did not look back. She had promised, and besides, there was nothing behind her now but a ring on a pillow and a life that had ended, and everything that mattered was ahead, in the dark, in the cold, riding east toward a future no one in that castle could imagine. She was 3 days gone before she was certain of the other thing. The nausea that woke her at dawn in a roadside inn, the tenderness, the strange new heaviness low in her body. She sat very still on the edge of the narrow cot and pressed both hands to her stomach and understood, with a clarity that felt almost cruel in its timing, that she had not left Ashmore alone. Kyle's child grew inside her, and when she closed her eyes and reached inward, past the wreckage of the broken bond, she felt not one small flickering life, but two, twinned and bright and utterly hers. She laughed. It came out cracked and half a sob, there in the grey light of a stranger's inn, one hand over her mouth. He had thrown her away to make himself a queen, and he had thrown away his heirs with her, and he did not know it, and would not know it. Not until she decided he should. Her children would never wear his collar. They would never bow at his gate. They would grow up strong and free and hers, and one day, when the world had turned enough, they would stand before him, not as beggars, but as equals, and he would finally understand the arithmetic of what he had traded away for a woman's flattery and a knight's ambition. She wiped her face. She stood. And Seraphine Vale, who was not Vale anymore, and not Ashmore, and not anyone's discarded bride, gathered her satchel and her secret and her cold, hard purpose, and she rode on into the dawn, carrying twins and a debt that would take 6 years to come due. 6 years is a long time to build a life, and Seraphine built hers the way she'd built the door in the wardrobe, quietly, patiently, one careful piece at a time, until it was strong enough to bear the weight of everything. She arrived in the free port city of Holveth in the autumn of that first year, heavy with child and light with coin, and she presented her letter of introduction to the trading house of a woman named Odette Marrow, and Odette read it and looked at the pregnant stranger standing straight-backed in her counting room, and asked only one question. "Can you count as well as you carry yourself?" Seraphine had answered by taking up a stack of the house's disputed ledgers, and by the time the lamps were lit, she had found 3 errors and 1 small quiet theft that Odette's own factor had been running for a year. She was hired before the babies came. The twins arrived in deep midwinter in a rented room above the counting house, with Odette holding one of her hands and a hired midwife holding the other. A boy first, dark-haired and furious, screaming his displeasure at the cold world. Then a girl, quieter, her eyes already open and watchful, taking in the lamplight as though memorizing it. Seraphine named the boy Aldrich and the girl Wynne, and she gave them her false surname, the one on the land deeds, Corran, and she held them against her chest in the freezing dawn, and made them a promise she intended to keep with every breath left in her body. "You will never be small," she told them. "You will never be thrown away. You are mine, and I am not weak, whatever any king ever said, and neither will you ever be." She did not speak of Cale. Not to the children, not to Odette, not to anyone. She let Halveth believe her a young widow, which explained the ring she did not wear and the grief she did not perform, and she poured everything she was into two things, her children and her work. The work came easily, more easily than it had any right to, because Seraphine had spent 3 years watching how a kingdom moved its money and its power without ever being invited to touch either. She understood debt. She understood how a proud house borrowed against its future to maintain its present. She understood, better than anyone in Odette's counting room, how the great territories of the Wolf lands actually stayed solvent, and how thin the margins were between a throne and a ruin. Within 2 years, she was Odette's partner, not her clerk. Within 3, the sign above the door read, Marrow and Corran, and merchants from 6 territories came to them to broker loans and settle disputes and move grain and iron and silver across borders that kings pretended to control, but that in truth answered to whoever held the notes. Seraphine held a great many notes. She acquired them the way she acquired everything now, quietly and completely, without fanfare. Until one grey morning, she looked up from her ledgers and realized that the trading house of Marrow and Corran was owed money by nearly every noble family in the eastern half of the Wolf lands, and that a not insignificant number of those debts led, by threads visible only to her, back toward the Ashmore territories and the failing court of the AlphaKing, because Ashmore was failing. The intelligence came in the way all intelligence came to a trading house, in scraps and rumors and the desperate letters of men who needed to borrow. Seraphine read them all. She learned that in the 6 years since she'd ridden east, Kael's kingdom had begun to rot exactly the way old Bram had smelled it starting to. She learned that Queen Isolde had proven a disaster as a ruler, all appetite and no discipline, that she'd emptied the treasury on tourneys and jewels and a summer palace that flooded in its first spring. She learned that the harvests had failed twice, and that Kael, distracted and prideful, had borrowed against the next 3 years to keep his crown looking golden while its foundations cracked. She learned that the neighboring alpha of the Drossel packs, a cold, calculating male named Corvin Thorn, had been extending Ashmore a great deal of very friendly credit, and that friendly credit from a predator is never friendship. It is a leash being fitted slowly around a throat. She learned, too, that the twins had inherited more than her cheekbones. Aldrich was 6, and already strong as a boy twice his age, quick to anger and quicker to forgive, with a wolf inside him that the free port healers said was uncommonly powerful for one so young. Wyn was 6 and watchful still, the child who noticed everything and said little, who could sit in a corner of the counting room for an hour, absorbing the rhythms of a negotiation, and then tell her mother afterward, precisely, which man had lied. They were royal, though they didn't know it. They carried the blood of the Ashmore kings, and it showed in 100 small ways that Seraphine catalogued with a mother's fierce pride and a strategist's careful attention. She did not raise them for revenge. She wanted to be clear about that, even in the privacy of her own heart. She raised them for themselves, to be whole and strong and free, and if the shape of a reckoning happened to be forming on the horizon, she was content to let it form without hurrying it. Cheap revenge was for the impatient. She had ridden away from Ashmore, promising herself that living well would be the only knife she'd ever need, and she'd meant it. But she was also not a fool, and she was not a saint, and when the pieces of a checkmate began arranging themselves on the board of the Eastern trade, she did not pretend she wouldn't reach out and move them. The man who taught her the last of what she needed was Halveth's harbour master, a broad-shouldered widower named Torsten Vale, no relation to her old name, a coincidence that made them both laugh the first time they compared it. Torsten was not a wolf. He was human, one of the many who lived in the free ports where the old pack laws held no dominion, and he ran the busiest harbor on the eastern coast with a fairness and a competence that had earned him respect from creatures who traditionally regarded humans as prey. He respected Seraphine for her mind before he ever noticed her face, which was, she realized much later, precisely why she let him closer than she'd let anyone in 6 years. He asked no questions about her past. He simply saw who she was now, a woman who could look at a manifest and know within a coin how much a cargo was worth and whether its owner was cheating her, a mother who brought her children to the docks and taught them the names of ships, a partner in a trading house that moved more silver in a season than the Ashmore treasury saw in a year. He fell for that woman slowly and honestly, and she found, to her own quiet astonishment, that the frost around her heart had thawed enough in 6 years to let a little warmth back in. She didn't marry him. She was not sure she would ever marry again. But she let him love her children, and she let him love her, and she began, cautiously, to believe that she had built something real out of the wreckage. It was Torsten who first spoke the name that changed everything. They were on the harbor wall at dusk, the twins throwing pebbles into the grey water below, and he mentioned offhandedly that a delegation from Ashmore was expected within the month, that the AlphaKing himself was said to be coming east to beg the free ports and the great trading houses for emergency credit. His kingdom was days from insolvency. His creditor, the Drossel Alpha Corvin Thorn, had called in a note that Ashmore could not pay, and the only institutions with enough silver to save him were the ones in Hallveth. "They'll come to us," Torsten said. "Marrow and Corran. You're the largest house on the coast. There's no one else who could cover a debt that size." He glanced at her, and something in her stillness made him pause. "Sarah, you've gone the color of the water." She was looking at her children in the fading light, at Aldrich's dark, furious energy, and Wynn's watchful calm, at the Ashmore blood in both their faces, and she felt the last piece of the board slide into place with a soft, terrible click. 6 years. She had asked the world only to turn enough, and here it was, turned all the way around, delivering the man who called her weakness back to her doorstep, as a beggar who did not yet know whose door he stood upon. "He's coming to me," she said softly, "to ask me for his life." Torsten had learned when to press and when to wait. He waited now, and the twins ran up the wall toward them, breathless and pink-cheeked, and Wynn tugged her mother's sleeve and asked why she looked like that, and Seraphine crouched down and gathered both her children against her, and breathed in the salt and child scent of them, and said, "Because something I've waited a very long time for is finally coming, and it's going to be all right. I promise you, it's going to be more than all right." She did not sleep that night. She sat at her desk in the counting house with a single lamp burning and pulled every ledger, every note, every scrap of Ashmore debt she had been quietly accumulating for 6 years, and she spread them across the great oak table, and she read them until she knew every figure by heart. And what she found, threaded through the arithmetic, was not just a kingdom in trouble. It was a trap. Because the more she traced the loans back, the more clearly she saw the shape of Corvin Thorn's hand behind them. The Drossel Alpha had not simply extended Ashmore friendly credit. He had engineered its ruin. Every failed harvest had been followed by a Drossel loan on generous terms. Every extravagance of Isolde's had been quietly encouraged, even funded, by Drossel gold that appeared exactly when temptation was highest. Thorn had been fattening Ashmore for the slaughter, loading it with debt it could never repay, and the note he had just called in was the killing stroke. When Cale failed to pay, and he would fail, Thorn would seize the Ashmore territories whole, its lands and its packs and its ancient throne, and he would do it wearing the mask of a wronged creditor rather than a conqueror. Kyle did not even understand he was already dead. He thought he was coming east to borrow his way out of a crisis. He did not know the crisis was a leash, that the friendly Alpha next door had spent 6 years tightening it, that the moment he'd chosen to break a bond and betray a loyal partner had been the moment he'd made himself weak enough to be devoured. He'd called her Winter and Weakness on his wedding night, and Winter, it turned out, had been circling him the whole time, and it wore Corvin Thorn's face. Seraphine sat back in her chair and looked at the spread of paper before her, and she felt the strategist in her come fully awake. Because she could save Ashmore, she held enough silver, held enough of Thorn's own leveraged positions through the tangled web of Eastern trade that she could break the trap if she chose. Or she could let it close, let Thorn have his prize, and watch Cale lose everything to a predator he'd been too proud to see. Both paths ended with the AlphaKing ruined. The question was only whose hand held the knife, and what she wanted to be true when it was over. She thought about her children, asleep upstairs. She thought about the throne that was theirs by blood, the throne their father had tried to deny them existed. And slowly, over the long hours of that lamplit night, a third path assembled itself in her mind, more patient and more complete than either of the others, and she began to write. The Ashmore delegation arrived 11 days later, and Seraphine received word of it the way she received all news, through the harbour and the counting room, before the great houses had even finished their formal greetings. She did not go to meet them. She let them settle into the finest lodging Halveth offered, let them make their approaches to the lesser trading houses first and be politely turned away. Let them learn over the course of a week that there was only one institution on the eastern coast with the silver to cover the debt Corvin Thorn had called in, and that its name was Marrow and Corran, and that the senior partner would see the AlphaKing's representatives only by appointment and only at her convenience. She was teaching them a lesson in the geometry of power before they even walked through her door, and they did not recognize the hand of the teacher. Odette watched her prepare with something between admiration and alarm. "You've never been cruel," the older woman observed on the morning the appointment was set. "Careful, yes. Ruthless in a ledger, certainly. But not cruel. This has teeth, Sarah. Whose throat are they in?" "Sit with me when they come," Seraphine said, "and you'll understand." She was arranging the counting room, and she arranged it like a stage, her own great chair with its back to the tall windows, so that anyone facing her would face the light and see her only in silhouette until she chose to be seen. The debt papers stacked precisely at her right hand, and on the desk before her, dead center, where a certain kind of man would eventually notice it, a plain white gold ring with the Ashmore sigil pressed into it. She had carried it for 6 years. She had taken it back off the pillow at the last moment before she rode away. The one thing of his she'd allowed herself to keep. Not out of sentiment, but out of foresight, because some part of her had always known she might need to lay it on a table one day and watch a proud face understand. They came at the appointed hour. Seraphine heard them in the outer room, the shuffle and murmur, the particular arrogance in the voice of a courtier accustomed to doors opening. Then the inner door swung wide, and the AlphaKing of the Ashmore territories walked into her counting house. 6 years had not been kind to Cale. He was still tall, still powerful across the shoulders, but the vitality that had made him seem carved from something eternal had drained out of him, leaving a man who looked hunted from the inside. There was grey in his dark hair that hadn't been there. There were lines around his mouth that had been cut by worry, not laughter. And behind him, in a gown far too fine for a diplomatic errand, trailing furs she surely couldn't afford, came Isolde, the Queen. Older too, harder around the eyes, with a discontent stamped so deep into her face that no amount of jewels could distract from it. Seraphine watched her former friend take in the counting room, the wealth of it, the quiet, obvious power, and she watched Isolde's expression sour with an envy she'd never learned to hide. Neither of them looked at the woman in the great chair with the light behind her. They looked at the room. They looked at the papers. Isolde looked at the ring on the desk with a flicker of something like recognition, and then dismissed it, unable to place it out of context. And Kyle, drawing himself up, addressed the silhouette with the practiced condescension of a king who believed he was doing a merchant an honor by appearing before her. "I am here to speak with the senior partner of this house," he said. "I am Kyle of Ashmore. I have not come to haggle with clerks." "The senior partner is speaking with you," Seraphine said. She did not raise her voice. She did not stand. She let the words fall into the room, and she let the silence after them stretch, and she watched Kyle's certainty waver just slightly, because there was something in that voice, something the 6 years hadn't quite buried, and a man who had once known her as intimately as a mate can know a mate felt the ghost of a bond that should have been dead stir in his chest and could not understand why. "Then let us be direct," Kyle said, recovering. "My kingdom requires a loan, a substantial one. I am told your house is the only one capable of extending it. The terms Ashmore offers are generous." "Ashmore offers nothing," Seraphine said. "Ashmore has nothing to offer. That is why you are here." She reached out and drew the top sheet from the stack at her right hand. "You owe the Drossel Alpha 800,000 silver marks, due in full at the turning of the season, or you forfeit your lands, your packs, and your throne under the terms of a note you signed 3 winters ago without reading it closely enough. You have come to me to borrow 800,000 marks so you can pay one predator by chaining yourself to another. That is the whole of your proposal, dressed up in the word generous." Kyle's jaw tightened. Isolde stepped forward, her voice sharp. "You forget yourself, merchant. You are speaking to a king." "I never forget anything," Seraphine said. "It's the foundation of my business." And she reached up, and she turned the lamp beside her chair, and the light shifted, and for the first time, the 2 people who had destroyed her on a candlelit night 6 years ago saw her face. She watched it happen. She had imagined this moment across 6 years and 1,000 sleepless hours, and the reality of it was colder and quieter and more complete than any imagining. She watched Isolde's painted face go slack and then white. She watched the Queen's hand fly to her mouth, watched the word form there without sound, and she watched Kyle who had called her weakness, Kyle who had promised to make her nothing by dawn. She watched the Alpha King of the Ashmore territories look upon the woman he had thrown away and feel the dead bond in his chest roar suddenly, agonizingly, back to life, because it had never truly broken. He had lied to Isolde that night, the way powerful men lie about the things they cannot do. He had never severed it. He had only abandoned it. And now the other end of it stood before him, in a great chair, with the wealth of a kingdom stacked at her hand, and the phantom wound he'd carried for 6 years and called by other names finally had a face again. "Seraphine," he breathed. "Corran," she corrected. "Seraphine Corran, senior partner of Marrow and Corran. The name Vale died in your castle, and the woman who was going to be Ashmore's queen died in the same hour, in a corridor outside a bridal chamber, listening to two people she trusted plan how to make her nothing by dawn. She let that land. She watched Isolde flinch. You'll be relieved to know the plan succeeded. I was nothing when I left. No name, no pack, no bond, no coin. But what I'd stolen from an allowance, you never bothered to count. You made me nothing, Kyle. And then I spent 6 years finding out exactly what nothing is worth when it decides to build itself into something you can't destroy. The room was utterly silent. Odette sat in the corner, still as stone, and understood at last whose throat the teeth were in. Kyle's mouth worked. Whatever a king expects to feel when he goes begging to a trading house, it is not the specific gravity of a betrayal returning to collect. And he had no words prepared for it, no strategy, nothing but the raw animal fact of a bond he'd wronged, standing before him, holding his kingdom's life in her hands. I didn't, he started. Seraphine, that night, it wasn't, don't. The single word cut cleaner than any blade. Do not stand in my house and tell me it wasn't what it was. I heard you. Every word. She smells like winter and weakness. You smell like the future. Consider it done. By dawn she'll be nothing. She recited his own words back to him, in a voice without heat, without tears, without any of the softness he might have known how to answer. Just the flat, cold delivery of a ledger being read aloud. I have carried those words for 6 years, Kyle. I know them better than my own name. So no, you will not tell me it wasn't what it was. You will stand there and you will listen, because you came to me for the only thing on this coast that can save you, and the price of it is that for once in your gilded life, you are going to hear the truth all the way to the end. And Kale, the Alpha King, who had commanded packs and kings and the woman before him, who had never in his life been made to simply stand and receive, stood and received. Because he had no choice, because the geometry of power had reversed itself completely, and he could feel it, and the wolf in him understood before the man did that he was in the presence of something he could no longer command. Isolde tried to salvage it. It was in her nature. She had always been the one who talked when talking was the wrong thing. Seraphine, she said, and she made her voice soft, made it into the voice of the girl who had braided hair at 14. Sister, whatever passed between us, surely you wouldn't let a whole kingdom fall over an old hurt. There are innocents in Ashmore. Children. The packs will starve if Thorn takes the lands. You were always so kind, so good. You can't have changed so much that you'd punish thousands for what 2 people did in a moment of weakness, Seraphine offered. And there it was, the dry cutting edge, the only humor she permitted herself. You want to talk to me about the fate of children, Isolde? She said it so quietly that both of them leaned in without meaning to. You want to appeal to me on behalf of the innocent. That's interesting, because I have thought a great deal about children over these 6 years. She rose from the great chair then, for the first time, and she came around the desk, and she was no longer a silhouette but a woman, tall and unbowed, and she picked up the white gold ring from the center of the desk and held it up between 2 fingers so the light caught the Ashmore sigil. Do you recognize this? Isolde's eyes locked onto it. Recognition dawned, and with it a dread she couldn't name. It's the ring you asked him to take off me, Seraphine said. The one you called a collar. I left it on the pillow the night I ran. Then I went back and took it, because I understood even then that I might need it someday to prove a thing that no one would believe from a merchant's mouth. She set it down on the desk with a soft click that sounded enormous in the silent room. I did not leave Ashmore alone that night, Cale. I want you to understand that clearly, because it is the center of everything that follows, and you deserve to feel its full weight. The door to the inner office opened. Seraphine had arranged this too, had timed it to the breath, and through it, hand in hand, walked two children. A dark-haired boy, strong and furious-eyed, 6 years old and radiating a wolf power that made both the king and queen go rigid where they stood. And a watchful girl, quiet, her eyes moving from face to face, cataloguing, understanding more than a child her age should. They came to stand beside their mother, and Aldrich looked up at the strange grey-haired man staring at him, and Wynne looked up at the woman in furs whose face had gone the colour of ash, and neither child knew what they were looking at, only that their mother's hand had come to rest on each of their shoulders like a benediction and a shield. "Their names are Aldrich and Wynne Corran," Seraphine said. "They are 6 years old. They were born in a rented room above a counting house in deep midwinter, the first year I was gone. And if you look at them, Kyle, if you truly look, you will see your mother's cheekbones on the girl and your own temper in the boy. And you will feel, if there is anything left in you that is honest, exactly what you threw away on your wedding night." The Alpha King of Ashmore made a sound she had never heard from him in 3 years of courtship or 6 years of imagining. It was not a word. It was the sound of a man being run through, low and broken, and he swayed on his feet, one hand reaching out toward nothing, toward the children, toward the past, toward the impossible arithmetic of what stood before him. Twins, his heirs, his blood, carried out of his castle in a satchel of stolen coin and raised into strength by the woman he'd called weakness, in a life he had known nothing of, while he squandered his kingdom on a woman who had given him nothing but ambition and ruin. "They're mine," he whispered. It wasn't a claim, it was a comprehension, arriving all at once, catastrophic. "They are mine," Seraphine said. "Let there be no confusion on that point ever again. I carried them. I birthed them. I raised them into what they are with these 2 hands, with no help from Ashmore, and no name from Ashmore, and no gold from Ashmore. You did not know they existed until this moment. You do not get to walk in and claim them because your blood happens to run in their veins. Blood is not the same as fatherhood, Kyle. You taught me that yourself, the night you decided your own bond was disposable." She looked down at her children, and her voice, which had been iron, softened just for them. "Go with Odette now, my loves. This is grown-up talk and it's nearly done. I'll come find you when it's finished." Odette rose and gathered the children and led them out, and Wynne looked back once at the strange man weeping silently in the middle of the counting room, and then the door closed, and it was just the 4 of them again, the wronged and the wrongers, the reversal complete. Seraphine returned to her chair. She sat. She folded her hands, and she began, at last, to lay out the checkmate she had spent 11 days constructing, the 3rd path, the one that ended with everyone she cared about safe, and everyone who had wronged her, holding the precise portion of ruin they had earned. "Here is what you don't know," she said, "and what will kill you if I don't tell you. Corvin Thorne is not your creditor. He is your executioner. Every loan the Drossel Alpha extended to Ashmore over the last 6 years was engineered to bring you to this exact hour, insolvent and desperate and out of allies. He funded your queen's extravagances. He encouraged your borrowing. He called in this note now, specifically now, because he knows you cannot pay it, and he intends to seize your entire kingdom the moment you default. You have not come here to save your throne, Kael. You have come here at the invitation of the man who is stealing it, to perform the last act of a play he wrote 3 years ago. She slid a stack of papers across the desk toward him. It's all there, the trail of it. I've been tracing it for months, because Thorn's leverage runs through the Eastern trade, and the Eastern trade runs through me. Kael stared at the papers. Isolde stared at them too, and Seraphine watched the Queen's face as the full picture assembled itself, watched her realize that the friendly Alpha who had flattered and funded her for years had been playing her the entire time, that her ruin had been the point. "He'll take everything," Kael said hollowly. "He would have," Seraphine agreed. "He still can if I do nothing. I hold enough of Thorn's own overextended positions to break him, but I hold them, not you. So the question in front of you is not what Ashmore will do. Ashmore is spent. The question is what I will choose. And I want you both to sit with the full weight of that, because it is the exact reversal of every conversation you ever imagined having with the she-wolf you threw away." She let the silence work. It was a thing she'd learned in 6 years of negotiation, that silence in a room full of desperate people does the work of 100 threats. Kael sank slowly into the chair across from her, the papers trembling in his hands, and Isolde stood behind him with her furs and her fear, and neither of them spoke, because for the first time in either of their lives they understood that speaking would not help. "There are 3 things I could do," Seraphine said at last. "The first is nothing. I let the season turn, you default, and Corvin Thorn swallows Ashmore whole. Your throne, your lands, your packs, your queen. You become a client of the Drossel court, if he keeps you alive at all, which I doubt he will, because a defeated Alpha is a liability, and Thorn does not keep liabilities. This is the path you're on right now. It costs me nothing. It ends with you erased, exactly as you promised to erase me. There's a symmetry to it I find almost restful." Isolde made a small sound. Kael did not move. "The second," Seraphine continued, "is that I break Thorn myself. I call in his leveraged positions across the Eastern trade. I collapse his credit. I ruin him the way he tried to ruin you. And in the chaos, Ashmore survives by default, because its executioner is dead. You'd keep your throne. You'd owe me everything. And I'd have made an enemy of the most dangerous Alpha on the continent to save the man who called me winter and weakness. I trust you understand why I find this path unappealing." "Then there's a third," Kael said. His voice was ragged. He was learning, slowly, the shape of the room he was in. "There's a third," Seraphine agreed, and she leaned forward. And now the strategist showed her full face, cold and brilliant and utterly in command. "The third is that I do not save you, Kael. I save Ashmore. And I save it not for you, but for them, for Aldrich and Wynne, who are the true and rightful heirs to that throne, whether you knew of them or not. Here is what will happen. Marrow and Corin will purchase the Drossel note in full. I have already arranged it. Thorn does not yet know that the silver behind the buyer is mine, because I've routed it through 3 intermediary houses precisely so that when he learns the truth, it will be too late to refuse. The moment that purchase completes, I hold your kingdom's debt, not Thorn. Ashmore's leash passes from his hand into mine." Kael's head came up. "And then," Seraphine said, "I will forgive it, all 800,000 marks, on conditions. You will abdicate. Not to me. I have no wish to rule wolves, and less wish to live in your castle. You will abdicate in favor of a regency, held by a council I approve, which will govern Ashmore in trust until Aldrich comes of age at 18, at which point the throne passes to him and to Wynne jointly, as the acknowledged and legitimate heirs of the royal line. Your children will inherit what you tried to deny they existed to claim. That is my price. That is the only price. Your kingdom lives, your bloodline keeps the throne, and you. She paused, and something almost like mercy moved beneath the ice. You walk away from all of it, a private man, free to spend the rest of your life however you choose, except that you will never again wield power over anyone, least of all over me or mine. You'd make my son a king, Kyle said slowly. I'd make my son a king, Seraphine corrected, gently and without mercy. The distinction is the whole of the matter. He'll be raised by me, here, in freedom, until he's old enough to choose whether he even wants that throne. If he doesn't, Wynne will rule, and if neither wants it, the council governs, and Ashmore becomes something new. I'm not handing you an heir to mold, Kyle. I'm handing your kingdom to two children you have no claim on, and I'm doing it because it's the only outcome where the innocent Pax your queen wept about don't starve, and where my children receive what is theirs by right, and where you receive exactly what you gave me. Nothing. A quiet, nameless nothing, and the rest of your life to understand what it's worth. It was Isolde who broke. She had been silent through the reversal, through the children, through the checkmate, and now the enormity of it reached her and she came apart. And it was ugly, and Seraphine watched it without satisfaction. You can't, the queen said. You can't just, I'm the queen, Kale is the king. You can't unmake us with a ledger. This isn't. There are laws. There are the elder councils. They'll never accept a merchant's bastards on the throne. They'll accept the alternative even less, Seraphine said, which is Corvin Thorn's boot on all their throats. And they are not bastards, Isolde. They were conceived in wedlock on the night of a lawful royal marriage, 3 hours before the groom betrayed his vows, by the oldest laws of the Wolflands, laws even the elder councils cannot overturn. They are the true-born heirs of the reigning king, and there are witnesses to their birth and to the marriage both. And I have spent 6 years and a great deal of silver making certain that the documentation is flawless. She looked at her old friend with something that was not quite pity. You wanted to be queen so badly. You helped a man break a sacred bond to get it. And now the woman that bond belonged to holds the only silver that can save your crown, and the price of it is that crown itself. I'd tell you there was a lesson in that, but I don't think you're capable of learning it, and I've stopped needing you to. After everything, Isolde whispered. The years, I loved you. We were sisters. You loved what I could give you, Seraphine said, which was proximity to a throne. The moment a better path to it appeared, you took it, and you didn't grieve me for a single hour. I know because I checked. In 6 years of watching Ashmore, do you know how many times either of you tried to find out if I was alive? Not one. You didn't wonder. You didn't care. You put on my dead friend's crown and you never looked back, and that is the whole measure of what your love was worth. She stood. I am not doing this to hurt you, Isolde. That's the part you'll never understand. I stopped thinking about hurting you years ago. I'm doing this because it is the correct arrangement of the pieces on the board, the one that protects the most people and rights the deepest wrong. And your ruin is simply a consequence of the wrong having been so deep. You are not the point of this. You were never the point. That, I think, will torment you more than any cruelty I could invent. Kyle had been staring at the papers in his hands, at the trail of Corvin Thorn's treachery, at the ruin he'd walked into blind. Now he set them down, and he raised his head, and he looked at Seraphine, and whatever he'd been 6 years ago, arrogant, appetitive, certain of his own centrality, it had burned away in the space of an hour, and what remained was a man seeing clearly for the first time in his life. "I accept," he said. Isolde whirled on him. "Kyle, I accept," he said again, louder, and there was something almost like peace in the wreckage of his face. "She's right, about all of it. The debt, Thorn, the children. She's right, and I have no move left. And even if I had, I don't deserve to make it." He looked at Seraphine, and the dead bond between them ached in the air like a bruise neither would ever press again. "I called you weakness. On the worst night of your life, I called you weakness, and I threw you into the dark, and you walked out of it, holding my kingdom and my heirs and my whole future in your hand, and you're choosing to be merciful when you could bury me. That's not weakness, Seraphine. I don't have a word for what that is. But it isn't weakness, and I was a fool who mistook his own smallness for strength." He stood, slowly, an old man at 40. "I'll abdicate. I'll sign whatever you put in front of me, and I'll spend the rest of my life knowing what I traded and what it was worth. That's the sentence, isn't it? Not ruin. Understanding." "Yes," Seraphine said quietly. "That's the sentence." The papers were signed within the week. She had them prepared, of course. She'd had them prepared before the delegation ever arrived, because a woman who builds a door in a wardrobe against a betrayal she prays will never come, does not enter a checkmate without the documents drafted. Kyle signed the abdication in the counting house with Odette and Torsten and 3 Elder Council representatives as witnesses, and the purchase of the Drossel note completed the same day, and when word of it reached Corvin Thorn in his cold northern keep, he understood at last that he had been outplayed by a merchant he'd never bothered to notice, and that the eastern trade had closed around his own leveraged positions like a trap, and that he had lost not only Ashmore, but a dangerous portion of his own power in the reaching for it. He came south in a fury, and he demanded audience with the senior partner of Marrow and Corrin, and Seraphine received him exactly as she'd received Cale, with the light behind her chair and the ledgers at her hand, and she showed him the arithmetic of his own ruin laid out in her flawless hand, and she offered him the same mercy she'd offered the king. "Withdraw, forgive what you're owed, and I will not collapse your credit and end you." He was smarter than Kyle. He took the deal in an hour, and he never troubled the eastern coast again, because he understood, as Kyle eventually had, that he was in the presence of something he could not command and dared not fight. Isolde did not stay for the abdication. She left Ashmore in the night, the way Seraphine once had, except that she took everything she could carry of value and left no ring on any pillow, and she was last heard of in a distant western territory, spending down the jewels she'd stolen, telling anyone who'd listen a story in which she was the wronged party. It found no purchase. The replacement always exits in disgrace, and disgrace, Seraphine reflected, is simply the truth catching up to a person who's been outrunning it. She did not pursue her. There was no need. Isolde carried her own punishment inside her, a hunger that had cost her everything and could never be filled, and no revenge Seraphine devised would sting half as much as a life spent as a discarded queen no one believed. The Regency Council took power in Ashmore at the turning of the season, governing in trust for 2 children in a free port who did not yet know they were heirs to a throne. Seraphine told them eventually, gently, in her own time, when they were old enough to understand, that a crown was a weight and not a gift, that they would one day have a choice to make, and years yet to make it in. Aldrich was fierce about it, wanting to know why his father had done what he'd done, and Seraphine answered him honestly, because she'd promised herself her children would never be lied to the way she'd been. Wynne was quiet about it, as she was quiet about everything, and later that night she came and climbed into her mother's lap, 6 going on 60, and said, "You could have let them all be ruined. You could have. Why didn't you?" And Seraphine held her watchful, brilliant daughter and said, "Because ruin is easy, my love, and it's what small people reach for. I wanted to be larger than the thing that was done to me. That's the only revenge worth having. You beat cruelty by refusing to become it." Kyle she saw once more, a year later. He'd taken a small house on the eastern coast, not far from Holvith, a private man now with no title and no power, and he'd written to ask, humbly, whether he might be permitted to know his children. Seraphine considered the letter for a long time. Then she wrote back that he might, on her terms, supervised slowly, as a stranger earning trust rather than a father claiming right, and that the moment he tried to make it more than that, it would end. He accepted the terms without argument, because he'd learned at last that terms were all he had left, and over the following years he became something small and careful in the twins' lives, a man who'd traded a kingdom for a lesson, and was trying, too late, to be worthy of the lesson. It was not forgiveness. Seraphine wasn't sure she had forgiveness in her, and she'd stopped feeling she owed it. But it was something more useful than forgiveness. It was the sight of a proud man made humble by the exact weight of what he'd thrown away, living every day inside the understanding of it. And if there was justice in the world, Seraphine thought, it looked like this. Not a scream, not a blade, but a man watching his children love a mother who'd survived him, and knowing he'd chosen this, knowing he'd called her weakness on the night she'd been strongest, and knowing he'd been wrong in a way that could never be unwritten. She married Torsten in the end, on the harbour wall at dusk with the twins throwing flower petals instead of pebbles into the grey water, a quiet ceremony with no crown and no throne and no vows sworn before gods who let bonds break, just two people who'd chosen each other for competence and kindness rather than status, which was, she'd come to understand, the only foundation worth building a life upon. Odette gave her away. Bram came east for it, old and stooped but alive, having outlived 3 kings and the rot he'd smelled starting, and he wept openly through the whole thing and told her afterward that he'd always known, that she'd live well enough to make it all worth the riding away. She held the old stablemaster's swollen hands and thanked him for the horse, and the bread, and the count of 200, and he waved it off the way brave people wave off the moment they were brave, and she loved him for it. The trading house of Marrow and Corrin became the greatest on the eastern coast, and then the greatest in the Wolflands, and Seraphine ran it with a fairness and a ruthlessness in exact and deliberate proportion until she was old and her children were grown, and Aldrich had chosen, at 18, to take the Ashmore throne after all, not because it was owed him, but because he'd decided he could do some good with it, and Wynne had chosen to rule the trade instead, her mother's true heir in the ledgers if not the crown, and the world, which had once remained ignorant of what it lost when a discarded she-wolf rode east in the dark, learned her name and spoke it with respect, and no one who met her ever again made the mistake of calling her weak. She thought sometimes, in her later years, of the night it all began. The words through the door, the bond snapping like a frozen branch, The ring on the pillow and the count of 200, and the enormous wheel of stars turning slow above the black towers of a castle she never entered again. And she understood, from the far side of a whole life built out of that wreckage, the thing she'd only half known when she was 23 and running for the Eastern Gate. That worth is not a gift handed down by those who hold power over you. It is not granted in a wedding vow or withdrawn in a whispered betrayal. It is proven, in the dark, in the cold, one careful piece at a time, by the refusal to become small, simply because someone with a crown decided you were. Kyle had tried to make her nothing, and she had gone out into the night and discovered that nothing, when it refuses to stay nothing, is the most dangerous thing in the world. Loyalty cannot be bought, and it cannot be broken by anyone but the one who holds it, and a woman who knows her own worth needs no king to confirm it. If this story moved you, if you felt the frost turn to fire in Seraphine's chest and cheered, the moment that chair turned toward the light, do this for me. Give it a like, so that others who need this exact reminder can find their way to it. Share it with someone in your life who's ever been called weak by a person, too small to see their strength, because they deserve to hear that the dark you get thrown into can become the place you build your whole future. Subscribe and join this community, because we tell stories here about people who were discarded and rose anyway, served their vindication cold, and won on their own terms. And tell me in the comments, if you'd been Seraphine, standing in that counting house with the ring on the desk and the whole kingdom in your hand, would you have shown the mercy she chose, or would you have let it all burn? I read every answer, and I promise you there are no wrong ones.